Imagine a woman alone in a room, surrounded by the greatest library the ancient world had ever known. She is not adorned in gold. She is not reclining on silk. She is bent over papyrus scrolls in multiple languages: Greek, Egyptian, Aramaic, Ethiopian, Hebrew. Reading, annotating, thinking. This is the Cleopatra that history forgot. Not the seductress, not the temptress, not the dangerous foreign queen that Roman poets sneered at in their verses, but a scholar, a linguist, a diplomat, a sovereign who carried the weight of a dying empire on her shoulders and refused, for as long as humanly possible, to let it fall. Everything you think you know about Cleopatra VII Philopator was filtered through the pens of her enemies. And today, we are going to read between those lines. She was born in Alexandria in 69 BCE into a dynasty already rotting from within. The Ptolemaic Kingdom, founded 3 centuries earlier by one of Alexander the Great's generals, had once been the wealthiest, most culturally vibrant empire in the Mediterranean world. But by the time Cleopatra drew her first breath, it was a shadow of that former greatness. Egypt still held enormous agricultural and economic power, still commanded the Nile's floodplains, still exported grain that fed half the ancient world. But politically, the Ptolemies had become something humiliating: clients of Rome, dependent on Roman goodwill, Roman military muscle, and Roman patience to survive. Her father, Ptolemy XII, known by the cutting nickname Oletes, the flute player, had paid an almost incomprehensible bribe to Julius Caesar and Pompey to secure Roman recognition of his reign. 60 million denarii. Money that should have fed armies and funded infrastructure instead disappeared into Roman coffers. The Egyptian population seethed. Alexandrian mobs were not a metaphor. They were a real and terrifying force, capable of dragging rulers from their palaces. Ptolemy XII was briefly expelled from his own kingdom and had to flee to Rome to beg for military reinstatement. He returned on Roman swords. His people never forgave him. This is the world Cleopatra grew up in. Not one of luxury and ease, but one of perpetual political crisis, existential anxiety, and violent family dynamics. The Ptolemaic dynasty had always been ruthless. Intermarriage between siblings, fratricide, poisoning, conspiracy. These were not aberrations in Ptolemaic Egypt. They were the operating system. Cleopatra's grandmother, her aunts, her siblings, nearly all would die violently. She absorbed this reality not as tragedy, but as curriculum. To survive in the Ptolemaic court meant learning to read every room, every face, every alliance. It meant understanding that love and power were always, in her world, entangled. What separated Cleopatra from the long line of Ptolemaic rulers before her was what she chose to do with her extraordinary education. The Ptolemies had always maintained the museum and library of Alexandria, the greatest intellectual institution of antiquity, home to mathematicians, astronomers, philosophers, and physicians. But most Ptolemaic rulers were Greek-speaking monarchs who governed Egypt from a cultural distance. They never bothered to learn Egyptian. For nearly 3 centuries, the rulers of Egypt could not speak to the vast majority of their own subjects without an interpreter. Cleopatra changed that. She learned Egyptian, not just the spoken vernacular, but the hieroglyphic and demotic scripts used in temples and administrative documents. She learned the language not as a curiosity, but as an instrument of power. A way to communicate directly with priests, soldiers, merchants, and farmers. Ancient sources, including the biographer Plutarch, note that she spoke at least 9 languages: Greek, Egyptian, Ethiopian, Troglodyte, Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, Median, and Parthian. Whether the precise number was 9 or somewhat fewer, the point is staggering. She was a linguist of extraordinary ability at a time when such mastery was almost entirely unprecedented among rulers of any kind. Think about what that meant strategically. When Cleopatra sat across from a foreign ambassador, she did not need interpreters who might soften her words, mistranslate nuance, or leak intelligence. She heard everything directly. She responded without filter. She negotiated in the native tongue of whoever sat before her. In a world where diplomacy was everything, this was a weapon of the highest order. If you're enjoying this story of the real Cleopatra, consider subscribing to the channel. We publish deeply researched historical documentaries every week, and there's much more to come. She came to power first at around 18 years old, following her father's death in 51 BCE, sharing the throne nominally with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, in the standard Ptolemaic fashion of co-regency. But the arrangement was always fragile. Her brother was a child, perhaps 10 years old, and the men around him, a court faction led by a eunuch named Pothinus and a general named Achilles, saw an opportunity. They were not interested in sharing power with an 18-year-old queen, no matter how formidable she was. Within 3 years, they had moved against her. Cleopatra was forced into exile in Syria, stripped of her throne and declared an enemy of the state by her own younger brother. She did not accept this quietly. From Syria, she began assembling an army. She was not lamenting her fate. She was calculating her return. And then history handed her one of its strangest turns. In 48 BCE, 2 of the most powerful men in the Roman world, Julius Caesar and Pompey, finally settled their years-long rivalry on the battlefield at Pharsalus in Greece. Caesar crushed Pompey's forces decisively. Pompey fled east toward Egypt, hoping to find refuge with the Ptolemaic court that he had once helped financially support. What he found instead was a political calculation dressed as hospitality. Pothinus and Ptolemy XIII's advisors, trying to curry favor with whoever would emerge as Rome's master, had Pompey murdered the moment his foot touched Egyptian soil. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria shortly after, he was presented with Pompey's severed head as a gift. Caesar, by all accounts, wept. Not from grief alone, perhaps, but from the shock of receiving his former colleague and son-in-law's head as a greeting. He was also furious. He had not come to Egypt for a murder. He had come, in part, to collect a debt. Egypt still owed Rome money from Ptolemy XII's vast bribe. And now he was embroiled in someone else's dynastic civil war. Cleopatra understood immediately what Caesar's arrival meant. He was the most powerful military and political force in the Mediterranean world. His support, or even his neutrality, could decide whether she or her brother controlled Egypt. She had one chance to make her case, but she was officially banned from Alexandria, and any attempt to arrive openly would mean death. What she did next has become one of history's most enduring stories, and beneath the romantic legend lies something far more revealing about her intelligence. She arranged to be smuggled into the royal palace inside a large sack. Some sources say a carpet. Some say a linen sack for bedding. The precise vessel matters less than the audacity. She was not carried to Caesar as a gift or a spectacle. She came to negotiate, alone, without an army, without allies, with nothing but her mind, her languages, her composure, and her reading of Caesar's character. What happened in that meeting remains private to history. But the result was clear. Caesar was not merely charmed. He was convinced. He saw in Cleopatra a ruler of superior ability compared to the child king faction that had murdered his ally. He threw his support behind her. He would help restore her to the throne. The Alexandrian war that followed was brutal and dangerous. Caesar himself nearly drowned escaping enemy soldiers in the harbor, and the great library may have suffered fire damage during the fighting. But Caesar prevailed. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile during the conflict. Cleopatra was restored as queen. Please do like this video if you find this version of Cleopatra more compelling than the myth. It genuinely helps this kind of historical storytelling reach more people. Her relationship with Caesar was strategic, personal, and ultimately productive in every sense. She bore him a son, whom she named Caesarion, Little Caesar, a child whose very existence was a political statement that Egypt and Rome were not merely allied, but dynastically intertwined. She visited Rome in 46 BCE, where Caesar honored her as a client queen and installed a golden statue of her in the Temple of Venus Genetrix. Rome was not amused. Roman writers seethed at the foreign queen living in Caesar's villa across the Tiber. They called her dangerous, immoral, corrupting. What they meant was that she was powerful in ways that made them deeply uncomfortable. Then, on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated in the Roman Senate. 23 stab wounds. The most powerful protector Egypt had managed to secure in a generation was dead on a marble floor. Cleopatra, who was still in Rome when it happened, was suddenly exposed. She returned to Alexandria. Caesarion was now her only dynastic card, and he was a child. The years that followed were a masterclass in political survival. Rome plunged into another civil war, this time between Caesar's former lieutenant Mark Antony and Caesar's adopted son Octavian on one side, against the conspirators Brutus and Cassius on the other. Cleopatra watched, calculated, and waited. She had sent limited aid to the Caesarian side, carefully, cautiously, hedging because she could not afford to back the wrong faction again. When Antony emerged victorious alongside Octavian after the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, Cleopatra faced a new summons. Antony, now controlling Rome's Eastern Empire, called for her to appear before him at Tarsus in Asia Minor to explain her ambiguous support during the war. She was, in diplomatic terms, being called to account. What she did at Tarsus has been refracted through 2,000 years of storytelling, until the strategy beneath it is almost invisible. She arrived on a magnificent barge, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, surrounded by theatrical ceremony and overwhelming spectacle. The ancient sources marvel at the visual splendor, but step back from the pageantry and ask, why? Why did she do it this way? Because she understood Mark Antony with precise clarity. He was a different kind of man from Caesar. Where Caesar was coldly intellectual, Antony was theatrical, emotional, passionate, and susceptible to grandeur. He was also genuinely powerful, commanding Rome's eastern legions. He was exactly the kind of man who needed to be met on his own emotional register. She did not arrive as a nervous client queen summoned to explain herself. She arrived as a goddess, forcing Antony to come to her. The psychological advantage was immediate and complete. Their partnership became one of the defining alliances of the ancient world. Militarily significant, politically complex, and yes, personally intimate. They had 3 children together. Antony named Cleopatra and Caesarion rulers of Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean territories in a dramatic ceremony historians call the Donations of Alexandria. It was a grand gesture that Rome, particularly Octavian, found outrageous. Stay with us until the end of this documentary. What comes next, the final chapter of Cleopatra's story, contains an insight about her death that most accounts get almost entirely wrong. Octavian was watching all of this with cold, calculating eyes. He was not a military genius in Antony's league, nor a scholar in Cleopatra's, but he was a political genius of the highest order, and he understood something crucial. The best way to neutralize both Antony and Cleopatra was not to frame the coming conflict as a Roman civil war, which would be deeply unpopular, but as a war against a foreign queen who had seduced a Roman general and threatened the Republic. Cleopatra became the villain in Octavian's propaganda machine. She was portrayed as a dangerous Oriental enchantress, a threat to Roman virtue, a woman who used sex as her primary weapon because the idea that she might have used intelligence was too threatening to accept. He even obtained Antony's will, through means of dubious legality, and read it publicly in Rome. Whether authentic or manipulated, it claimed Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra. Roman outrage was immediate and volcanic. War became inevitable. It came to its decisive moment at the Battle of Actium in September of 31 BCE off the western coast of Greece. The engagement did not go well for Antony and Cleopatra's combined fleet. Historians still debate what exactly happened. Whether Cleopatra's withdrawal of her ships was a prearranged tactical retreat to preserve the fleet and treasury, or a panicked flight, or something more calculated. What is clear is that Antony followed her, and the battle was lost. Octavian had won. They retreated to Alexandria. Antony, receiving false reports that Cleopatra had died, fell on his sword, though he survived long enough to die in her arms. The woman who had governed one of the world's greatest kingdoms for 2 decades watched the man she had governed alongside for the last decade die, and then she faced Octavian alone. She met with Octavian. She attempted, by most scholarly accounts, to negotiate, to preserve something, to keep Caesarion alive, to protect her children, to salvage whatever could be salvaged. Octavian was polite, gave her no commitments, and had Caesarion quietly hunted down and killed the moment it served his purposes. And then Cleopatra died. She was 39 years old. The ancient sources say she died from the bite of an asp, a cobra smuggled to her in a basket of figs. The image is poetic, and it may be true. It may also be that she used a poison she had carefully studied, given her documented interest in toxicology. What is beyond serious historical dispute is that she chose her death. She was not going to be paraded through Rome in chains. She was not going to be displayed as Octavian's trophy in a triumphal procession. She had seen what Rome did to the defeated. She chose to deny him that moment. That choice was her final act of sovereignty. In a life defined by political calculation, her death was perhaps the most political act of all. With her death, the Ptolemaic Kingdom ended. Egypt became a Roman province. The 300-year dynasty that had begun with one of Alexander's generals closed with a woman who was, in many respects, the most capable ruler it ever produced. And then the rewriting began. Octavian, now Augustus, the first Roman emperor, had every incentive to ensure that history remembered Cleopatra as a seductress rather than a strategist, a dangerous foreign temptress rather than a brilliant sovereign who very nearly succeeded in preserving Egyptian independence against the most powerful empire on earth. Roman poets like Horace and Virgil obliged, crafting verses that painted her as a monster of lust and ambition. Subsequent centuries absorbed that portrait uncritically. She spoke 9 languages and is remembered for her eyeliner. She studied philosophy, mathematics, and medicine and is remembered for a carpet. She governed a kingdom of millions for 2 decades with extraordinary sophistication and is remembered as a woman who seduced great men. The real Cleopatra deserves better than the myth. She was a queen who inherited a dying kingdom and fought with every weapon available to her. Intellect, language, diplomacy, alliance, and ultimately death itself, to keep it alive. She very nearly won. That she lost does not make her a cautionary tale about ambition or desire. It makes her a figure of genuine tragic grandeur, a ruler of extraordinary gifts, outmaneuvered not by her own failings, but by the overwhelming force of a rising empire that the ancient world had no precedent for resisting. History called her a seductress. She was, in fact, one of the last great rulers of the ancient world. And it took 2,000 years and the slow, careful work of historians willing to read past Roman propaganda to begin seeing her clearly. If this documentary changed how you think about Cleopatra, please leave a comment below. We'd love to know which part of her story surprised you most. Share this video with someone who only knows the myth. And subscribe if you believe that history's most misunderstood figures deserve to be understood. There are many more stories like this one waiting to be told.